Hello, everyone. We're now midway through Module 4 for PBH 613. What I'd like to do now is give you a short demonstration of a very simple logic model, which I think might actually help you a little bit more with some of the content and some of your learning materials for both Modules 3 and 4. I feel like this example is a great simple example of just sort of what are the elements for your key aspects of a logic model. But another thing I'd like to discuss today is a little bit more about the common pitfalls when you're creating and using logic models, in addition to the things to remember when you're designing your logic modules, so you don't necessarily get yourself overextended or overcomplicate the intent of what you're trying to design. So let's get started. What I'd like to talk about first is just to give you a big picture of, well, what is this entire logic model exercise about? So as we know, with program evaluation, logic models are perhaps the most widely used tools in our work. They provide reasonably straightforward and visual illustrations of the linkages between program activities and program outcomes. We use these logic modules frequently when we're looking at stakeholder engagement and also how we communicate and also how we look at project planning both before, during, and after the intervention. When we think about logic models, think about them in terms of in what ways can they help improve our relationship with the stakeholders and communities that we're seeking to work with. So this is a pretty straightforward example of a logic model that was designed with the intention of an intervention to seek to improve the rates of child abuse and reported child neglect cases among participants who were a part of this intervention. So as you can see on the left-hand side of the graphic, initially you start out with your inputs. This is going to be any resources that were put to use as part of the intervention. This can be people, time, money, or other resources such as supplies or materials. You want to think about it in terms of what specifically were the inputs that were used. Were they sufficient and were they timely? So when you're designing your input section, you're thinking about just mapping out what were those things that were the inputs that you can anticipate for this specific intervention. The next part of the logic model will be your outputs. So this is looking at your specific activities. In this case, there was a curriculum that was designed for parents to help educate them a little bit more about the importance of safety and also ideal care for their children. So in this case, the guiding evaluation questions were, was the curriculum developed, and were the 6 different interactive modules or sessions interactive and delivered appropriately? Another way to think about outputs in a logic model would be in terms of the actual participation rate. So you want to look at, did all of those parents attend who were invited? Who didn't attend? Did those who were invited attend all 6 sessions or some of those sessions? What might have been some of those reasons? And you see we now have linked the staff, money, and partners to the curriculum, which then gets into the targeted parents who attended this intervention. Now, when we get into the outcome side towards the right-hand side of our logic model, we get into the short term, the intermediate, and the long term. And this is something that you've been learning a little bit more about in your Module 3 and Module 4 readings and videos for this course. So in terms of short term, we want to get a sense of to what extent did the parents who attended this intervention increase knowledge? Did they learn new approaches? What else might have happened as a result of them participating in this curriculum? In terms of your intermediate or medium outcomes, you want to get a sense of whether or not the parents who participated in this curriculum actually improved or demonstrated an improved skill set. In what context? What differences do these skills improve for the parents compared to before they had this intervention? And long term, you want to think about, has there been a decrease in rates of reported child abuse and neglect among the parents who participated in this curriculum? Were the goals of the overall intervention achieved? Now, the reason I show you this specific logic model is that it is straightforward in the sense of the specifics in the actual graphic boxes that you see within the logic model. You see the linkage of the inputs to the outputs to the outcomes. And you also get a sense of the short term versus intermediate versus long term. And as you can see, this uses very simple and straightforward language. So you want to think about preventing one of the first and most important pitfalls to avoid when you're creating and using logic models, which is to always be aware that people can be averse to terms that are used in your specific logic model. You want to use plain language to the best as you can possibly achieve. You want to think about complex acronyms and avoid them. You want to also think about whether or not the terms that you use in your logic model make sense to all users who may be reading your specific logic model. Is there some aspect of terminology that could have multiple meanings across different types of regions or parts of the country? Avoid anything that could be complicated in a way that could make your logic model become overcomplicated. Another thing you want to think about too with your logic model is always to be very clear about the purpose of the logic model. Another common pitfall for logic models will be often that it may or may not engage your stakeholders in terms of helping them understand more about the program activities that are intended in your program. So if the logic model's purpose is to help engage your stakeholders and build consensus, you want to make sure that the logic model itself has a very clear delineation of being aesthetically appealing, but also visually efficient. So I would say that this example shown here is very much something that is straightforward to the point, but also it doesn't include any complex language or expansive details that would be something that would be too complicated for a reader. Another thing you want to think about with logic models is to avoid another pitfall, which is that some people may necessarily get confused with the connections between the elements. So what that means is that understanding and distinguishing between inputs, outputs, outcomes, and even impacts is fundamental to this process. Logic models are often lists of items within columns or bins. So as we see here, we have a total of 6 specific columns. We have the inputs, we have 2 levels of outputs. This is column 2, column 3. And then this would be column 4, 5, 6 for the outcomes, for short term, intermediate, and long term. But in terms of thinking about these columns themselves, you don't necessarily want to detract from the fact that these specific arrows are meant to depict linkages and relationships between these different components of the logic model. So just keep in mind that when you're talking about translating theory into practice, you want to make sure that the connections between the inputs, outputs, and outcomes are not misconstrued in terms of the way they're linked together. So you don't want the person reading your logic model to get caught up in the column form. You really want to make sure that you've mapped things in a way that are straightforward with the linkages. And also, I want you to think a little bit more about the fact that another common pitfall is that sometimes logic models may not be written in a way that's culturally and linguistically appropriate. So you want to think about whether or not there are aspects of your logic model that are relevant in terms of the meaningful representations and cultural relevance of certain terminology. It's also possible that with the usage of arrows and these shapes, that it may not be ideal for all populations. Think about reading level as well in terms of who your stakeholders are. If you're designing a program with a community and you know that there may be individuals with low levels of health literacy or low levels of literacy, you don't necessarily want an extremely complex logic model. And finally, you want to make sure that your logic model is not too dense with words or lines that are difficult to understand. So in other words, we want to strive for simplicity, but we don't necessarily want to overcomplicate the scope of our logic model. So I hope that this was a helpful sort of way to think about the context of what we're learning in Module 4. And I hope that as you design your own logic modules for the course, you can think a little bit more about simple, plain language and also clear graphical depictions in these columns. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you in the course.